The story doesn't begin with glamour, tragedy, or cinematic plot twists. It begins with a grocery bag tearing open at the worst possible moment. The kind of moment that feels designed by the universe specifically to test your patience. Helena stood in the fluorescent-lit aisle of the supermarket, watching helplessly as apples tumbled from the split plastic, rolling across the polished floor like they'd suddenly developed minds of their own. One headed toward the produce section, another spun in a lazy circle near her feet, and a third made a determined break for the dairy aisle, as if it had somewhere important to be. "Oh, perfect," she muttered under her breath, the words carrying that particular tone of someone who dealt with far worse than rebellious fruit. Helena was a black woman in her late 30s, with curves that filled out her worn jeans and faded blue sweater, the kind of comfortable, practical clothes she'd learned to hide in over the years. Her light brown curls, highlighted by years of sun and the occasional careful treatment she allowed herself, caught the harsh overhead lights as she bent down to gather the scattered apples. Those curls were one of the few things about her appearance she'd never tried to change, even during her darkest periods of self-doubt. She moved methodically, picking up each apple with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned not to make a scene, not to draw attention, not to take up more space than absolutely necessary. It was a lesson she'd internalized so deeply that it had become automatic. The constant calculation of how to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. That's when she heard it. "Dude, look at the state of her." Even the bag couldn't handle it. The voice came from somewhere behind her, male and young, dripping with that particular brand of casual cruelty that some people mistake for humor. His friend's laughter followed immediately. Sharp, loud, designed to be heard. Helena's hand froze mid-reach, her fingers just inches from another apple. The linoleum floor suddenly felt colder beneath her palm. That old, familiar sensation crept over her like ice water in her veins, the feeling of being reduced, diminished, made small by someone else's words. For just a second, maybe two, she was back in every moment of her life when someone had decided her body was public property, available for commentary, for judgment, for ridicule. Just a second. Then she breathed. A long, slow inhale that filled her lungs completely, held for a beat, then released. She'd learned this breathing technique during the worst months of her last relationship, when her ex-boyfriend's constant criticisms about her weight, her intelligence, her worth, had nearly convinced her he was right. The therapist she'd finally worked up the courage to see had taught her this: how to ground herself, how to find her center when the world tried to knock her off balance. She stood slowly, gathering the apples in her arms, refusing to rush, refusing to perform shame for an audience that didn't deserve the satisfaction. The two men were still behind her. She could feel their eyes, hear the residual snickering they weren't quite bothering to suppress. They were probably in their mid-20s, she guessed, young enough to think cruelty was still edgy, old enough to know better. Helena walked to the checkout counter with her rescued apples and the few other items she'd managed to collect before the bag incident. A container of yogurt, some bananas that had survived in a separate bag, a loaf of whole-grain bread. The cashier, a teenager with purple-streaked hair and a name tag that read, Jamie, looked at her with that awkward, sympathetic smile people give when they've witnessed something uncomfortable but don't know how to address it. "Sorry about your bag," Jamie said quietly, already reaching for a more substantial replacement. "It happens," Helena replied, managing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was fishing her debit card from her wallet, trying to calculate whether she had enough in her account to cover everything, plus maybe a small coffee from the cafe section, a tiny luxury she allowed herself on Fridays, when a new voice cut through the ambient noise of the supermarket. "Gentlemen, is there a problem here?" The voice was firm without being loud, authoritative without being aggressive. Helena glanced up to see the store manager approaching, and something in his bearing immediately commanded attention. He was a man in his 50s, gray threading through his dark hair, wearing the standard store uniform, but somehow making it look dignified. His eyes swept the scene with the kind of practiced assessment that came from years of reading people, situations, the subtle dynamics of public spaces. The two young men straightened immediately, their faces shifting through a rapid succession of expressions. Surprise, attempted innocence, nervous calculation. "No problem, sir," one of them said, too quickly, too eagerly. "Just shopping." The manager's gaze lingered on them for a long moment, and Helena could see him cataloging, filing away, making mental notes. Then his attention shifted to her, and something changed in his expression. A flicker of recognition that seemed to go deeper than simply remembering a regular customer. Helena just wanted to pay for her groceries and leave. She wanted to go home to her small apartment, where she could be alone with her thoughts, where she didn't have to navigate the exhausting work of existing in public while fat, while black, while female. She wanted to curl up on her second-hand couch with a book and pretend, just for an evening, that the world was kinder than it actually was. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The manager moved to the register, gently gesturing for Jamie to step aside. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who knew the system intimately, accessing screens and menus that the regular cashiers probably never saw. "Mrs. Helena Costa," he said, and there was something in his tone. Not surprise, but confirmation. Like he was verifying something he'd already suspected. "Your VIP account is active." The words hung in the air like a non sequitur. Helena stared at the screen, then at the manager, completely confused. VIP? Her? That didn't make any sense. She'd never signed up for anything like that. Never requested special treatment. Never even imagined she was the type of person who qualified for such things. In her mental economy, she was firmly placed in the category of people who were grateful just to be tolerated, let alone celebrated. Behind her, the two men had gone completely still. She could feel their shock radiating through the space between them, thick and palpable. The manager leaned in slightly, speaking in a voice that was lower but somehow carried perfectly in the suddenly quiet checkout area. "Your investment saved this store last year. Everyone here knows who you are, Mrs. Costa." And then the memory hit her, arriving with the force of something she'd deliberately tried to forget, because it made her uncomfortable to acknowledge her own capabilities. It had been 9 months ago, maybe 10. She'd been in the store doing her weekly shopping when she'd overheard the manager, this same man, having a tense conversation with someone on the phone near the office entrance. The words receivership and foreclosure and end of quarter had filtered through. And even through her own fog of depression and self-doubt, her brain had automatically started analyzing the financial situation. Helena had degrees in business and finance, earned years ago when she'd still believed in her own potential, before a series of toxic relationships and cruel bosses had systematically dismantled her confidence. She'd been working as a file clerk at a medical office, a job so far below her qualifications that her former professors would have wept. But it was steady, and it didn't require her to advocate for herself or believe she deserved better. That day in the store, something had possessed her, maybe desperation to feel useful, maybe muscle memory of who she used to be, and she'd approached the manager after his call. She'd introduced herself awkwardly, apologized for overhearing, then proceeded to spend 2 hours going through the store's financial statements that he'd pulled up on his office computer. Skeptical, but desperate enough to listen. She'd found the problems immediately. Inventory mismanagement, supplier contracts that were bleeding money, a POS system that was creating accounting discrepancies, marketing spend that wasn't generating returns. She drafted a reorganization plan right there, refused any payment because she couldn't quite believe her advice was worth money, and then had deliberately tried to forget about it, because thinking about what she was capable of made the gap between her potential and her reality too painful to bear. She'd had no idea the plan had actually been implemented, let alone that it had been successful enough to save the store. The manager, she now remembered his name was Robert, continued speaking, his voice carrying that tone of respectful acknowledgement that she'd almost forgotten could be directed at her. "The owners were so impressed with your work that they implemented your strategies across the entire regional chain. We've been looking for you for months to thank you properly, but you'd only left your first name." Helena felt something shifting inside her chest, like tectonic plates rearranging after years of pressure. The two young men behind her had begun backing away, their faces cycling through shame and fear. perhaps finally understanding that they'd targeted someone who was so far out of their league, they couldn't even see the scoreboard. "Sorry," one of them mumbled, the word barely audible, coated in the kind of insincere regret that comes from being caught rather than from genuine remorse. "We didn't mean—" But Helena wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at Robert, at Jamie, whose purple-streaked hair was now accompanied by a wide, genuine smile, at the other customers who'd paused in their shopping to witness this unexpected revelation. "I didn't do it for recognition," Helena said quietly. And it was true. She'd done it because seeing a problem she could solve and not acting felt impossible, even in her diminished state. She'd done it because some core part of her, buried under years of accumulated hurt, still believed that her skills had value. "We know," Robert replied, "which is exactly why we want to recognize you anyway." Helena paid for her groceries. Robert insisted on a store discount that felt more symbolic than necessary, and left with her items in a properly reinforced bag. The two men had already disappeared, and she found she didn't care where they'd gone or what they were thinking. They'd become irrelevant the moment she'd remembered her own worth. But as she walked to her car, as she loaded her groceries into the trunk of her aging Honda Civic, as she sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel, not yet turning the key, Helena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: possibility. The next several days passed in a strange, dream-like quality. Helena went to work at the medical office, filed papers, answered phones, made coffee for doctors who barely acknowledged her existence. But something had fundamentally shifted. Every time someone treated her as invisible or interchangeable, she remembered, "You saved an entire store. Your mind is worth something. You matter." It was such a simple realization, and yet it felt revolutionary. She started small. She began speaking up in meetings when she noticed inefficiencies, even though her suggestions were initially met with surprised stares from coworkers who'd grown accustomed to her silence. She updated her LinkedIn profile, adding her actual qualifications instead of the bare-bones placeholder she'd maintained for years. She went through her closet and pulled out some of the nicer clothes she'd bought in a brief period of optimism years ago. Clothes that fit her body as it actually was, not as some diet plan promised it might become. The light brown curls that she'd been straightening religiously every 2 weeks, she let them spring free, natural and unapologetic. She didn't do any of this expecting anything to change. She did it because she was tired, so profoundly tired, of making herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. And then, 3 weeks after the incident at the supermarket, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer. Her anxiety still defaulted to assuming any unexpected call was bad news. But something made her pick up. "Is this Helena Costa?" The voice was professional, female, efficient. "Yes? My name is Patricia Reeves. I'm a senior editor at Modern Commerce magazine. Robert Williams from Save More Markets gave me your contact information. I'd like to discuss featuring you in an article we're developing about unconventional business consultants who are reshaping local economies." Helena had to sit down. Modern Commerce was the magazine she read on her phone during lunch breaks, hiding the screen when co-workers walked by because she was afraid they'd mock her for having ambitions above her station. It was the publication she'd subscribed to even during the worst financial months, cutting other expenses to justify that one small connection to the professional world she'd once hoped to inhabit. I'm not sure I'm who you're looking for," she started, the old habits of self-deprecation rising automatically. "Mrs. Costa," Patricia interrupted gently. "Robert tells me you saved his business with a 2-hour consultation you refused to be paid for. The Save More regional chain has reported a 43% increase in profitability using your strategies. You're exactly who we're looking for." Yeah. The interview happened the following week in a coffee shop Helena chose specifically because it was far enough from her workplace that she wouldn't risk running into anyone she knew. Patricia turned out to be a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, who asked questions that went beyond the surface level of what Helena had done and dug into why she'd helped, why she'd refused payment, why she'd tried to forget about it afterward. Helena found herself talking about things she'd never articulated before. the slow erosion of confidence that happens when you exist at the intersection of multiple marginalizations. The way society teaches certain bodies that they should be grateful just to be tolerated. The exhausting mathematics of making yourself palatable to people who've already decided you're worth less than they are. But something changed, Patricia observed, her pen hovering over her notepad. At the store, when the manager recognized you, what shifted? Helena considered the question carefully. I remembered that my value existed before anyone validated it. I'd been waiting for permission to believe in myself, and I suddenly realized that permission was never coming from outside. I had to give it to myself. The article came out 6 weeks later. It was 3 pages with a photograph that Helena had initially hated. She looked too big, too visible, too much, but then gradually came to appreciate. In the photo, she was sitting in that coffee shop, her light brown curls framing her face, wearing a burgundy blouse that she'd bought specifically for the shoot, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her expression thoughtful and serious and undeniably intelligent. The headline read, "The Consultant Who Doesn't Want Credit: How Helena Costa is Rewriting the Rules of Business Success." Her phone started ringing within hours of the magazine hitting newsstands and going live online. Business owners, nonprofit directors, even a few corporate executives who'd seen the article, all of them wanting her expertise, her insight, her particular way of seeing problems that others missed. Helena gave notice at the medical office 2 weeks later. Her boss seemed surprised that she was leaving, which told her everything she needed to know about how invisible she'd managed to make herself. She cried that night, but they were complicated tears. Grief for the years she'd lost to self-doubt, relief that those years were ending, fear that she'd somehow mess up this second chance. But she didn't mess it up. The opportunity that changed everything came 3 months after the article, delivered in an email with the Save More corporate logo in the header. The regional CEO, a woman named Diana Ochoa, wanted to meet. The meeting took place in a downtown office that was all glass and chrome and the kind of expensive minimalism that usually made Helena feel like an intruder. But Diana greeted her warmly, offered excellent coffee, and got straight to the point. "We want to launch a mentorship program," Diana explained, pulling up a presentation on the large screen in the conference room, specifically targeting women entrepreneurs who face systemic barriers, women of color, plus-size women, women with disabilities, women who've been told in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways that they don't belong in business. Helena leaned forward, her interest genuinely captured. Diana continued, "We want to call it the Helena Project, and we want you to lead it. The program would provide free financial consulting, business strategy development, and mentorship to qualifying entrepreneurs. Save More would fund it as part of their community investment initiative, and Helena would have full autonomy over the selection process and methodology. She'd be paid a proper salary, a number that Diana wrote down and slid across the table, a number so far above what Helena had been making that she had to read it 3 times to believe it was real. "Why?" Helena asked, the question escaping before she could think better of it. "Why me? Why this much investment?" Diana smiled, and it was the smile of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. "Because you're exactly the kind of person who understands what these entrepreneurs are facing. You've lived it. And because your 2-hour free consultation generated more value than some firms we've paid 6 figures. Imagine what you could do with actual resources and time." Helena accepted on the spot, then went home and cried again. Different tears this time. Purely relief and joy, and the overwhelming sensation of finally being seen for who she actually was. The public launch event for the Helena Project was scheduled for a Friday evening, 4 months later. Save More had rented out a community center, invited local business owners, entrepreneurs, press, and community leaders. Helena had been nervous for weeks leading up to it, despite Diana's reassurance and the concrete evidence of the program's value in the applications that had already started rolling in. She chose her outfit carefully, a deep purple dress that hugged her curves without apology, that announced her presence rather than trying to minimize it. She wore her natural curls full and free, styled but not constrained. She'd even bought new shoes. Low heels that were comfortable enough to stand in for hours, but elevated enough to add that extra note of professionalism and confidence. The event space filled quickly, with far more people than they'd anticipated. The program had struck a nerve, resonated with a need that was apparently far more widespread than even Diana had projected. Helena stood backstage, listening to the murmur of the crowd, doing her breathing exercises, reminding herself that she belonged here, that she'd earned this. Diana took the stage first, giving an introduction that outlined the program's goals and its potential impact. Then she said the words Helena had been both anticipating and dreading. Please welcome the founder and director of the Helena Project, Helena Costa. The applause as Helena walked onto the stage was genuine and enthusiastic. She took her position behind the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd, and her breath caught for just a moment. There, near the back of the room, wearing the vests and name tags of the event's freelance staff, were the two young men from the supermarket. They were carrying trays, presumably hired to help with refreshments, and they'd frozen in place when Helena appeared on stage. She watched recognition dawn on their faces, followed by what looked like genuine mortification. For a split second, Helena felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction. They'd mocked her, reduced her, tried to make her feel worthless, and here she was on stage with her name on a major community program. The universe had delivered justice in the most poetic way possible. But then she remembered how it had felt to be diminished, and she chose something different than revenge. Diana was speaking again, explaining the specifics of the program, outlining the funding structure, introducing the advisory board. And then came the moment Helena hadn't been prepared for. The Helena Project, Diana announced, is named not just for its founder, but for its philosophy. Helena means light in Greek, and this program is designed to illuminate opportunities for women who've been kept in the shadows. It will provide not just financial support, but recognition, validation, and the message that these women have always had value. Society just failed to acknowledge it. The applause that followed was thunderous. Helena felt tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back, maintaining her composure. She could see the two young men near the back, their heads lowered, their body language radiating discomfort. When Diana handed her the microphone, Helena took a moment to gather her thoughts. She hadn't prepared a formal speech. Diana had told her to speak from the heart. "A few months ago," Helena began, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her, "I was picking up apples from a supermarket floor while someone made jokes about my body. I'd spent years believing that I had to earn the right to take up space, that I had to be smaller, quieter, less visible to be acceptable." The room had gone completely silent. People were leaning forward, listening intently. "But here's what I've learned. Nobody here needs to fit anyone else's standards to be extraordinary. Your value doesn't come from other people's validation. It exists inherently in your skills, your perspective, your experiences. The Helena Project exists because there are thousands of women who have everything they need to succeed, except the recognition that they deserve the opportunity to try." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience, deliberately not looking at the two men, but knowing they could hear every word. "This program isn't about revenge on a system that undervalued us. It's about correction, about finally aligning resources with the talent that's always been there. It's about saying, you were always enough. We're just finally catching up." The applause wasn't just for her words. It was for everything those words represented. The journey, the transformation, the refusal to let cruelty have the final word. Helena saw business owners nodding, young entrepreneurs wiping away tears, community leaders already mentally cataloging the people they wanted to nominate for the program. As the formal program concluded and the reception began, Helena found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk, to thank her, to share their own stories of being underestimated and overlooked. She listened to each one, made connections, exchanged contact information, felt the concrete reality of the network she was building. At one point, she saw one of the young men from the supermarket approaching hesitantly. She excused herself from her current conversation and turned to face him. "Mrs. Costa," he started, and his voice was shaking slightly. I need to apologize for what I said that day. There's no excuse for it. I was cruel and thoughtless, and I've thought about it almost every day since. Seeing you up there tonight," he stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "You deserved better than how I treated you. Everyone does." Helena studied him for a moment. He looked genuinely remorseful, not just embarrassed at being caught, but actually contrite. She could have savaged him, reminded him exactly how his words had felt, used her current position to make him feel as small as he'd tried to make her. She could have been perfectly justified in doing so. Instead, she said, "Thank you for apologizing. What matters now is what you do going forward, how you treat people, how you think about worth and dignity, how you use whatever platform or power you have." He nodded, relief and gratitude evident on his face, and backed away respectfully. Helena watched him go, then turned back to the reception, to the people who saw her value, to the future she was actively building. Later that night, back in her apartment, Helena sat on her couch with a glass of wine and her laptop, reviewing the applications that had already come through for the Helena project. Each one was a story, a woman with skills and dreams and barriers, someone who just needed someone else to see their potential and give them the tools to realize it. She thought about the torn grocery bag, about apples rolling across the floor, about how such a small, stupid moment had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Not because the moment itself was important, but because it had been the precise instant when she'd stopped accepting other people's assessment of her worth. Helena opened a new document and started drafting the evaluation criteria for the program's first round of acceptances. Outside her window, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy. Tomorrow, she'd go to her new office, meet with her newly hired program coordinator, continue building something that would outlast any individual moment of cruelty or kindness. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply sit with the satisfaction of becoming, finally and undeniably, the person she'd always had the potential to be. Not despite her body, her history, her struggles, but inclusive of all of it, transformed into wisdom and empathy and unshakable knowledge of her own worth. The story didn't end with revenge or vindication, though both had their moments. It ended with purpose, with meaning, with the quiet revolution of a woman who'd learned that the only permission she'd ever needed was her own. And in learning that lesson, she'd created a way to teach it to hundreds of others who were still waiting for someone to tell them they were allowed to be extraordinary. They always had been. The world was just finally starting to notice.